All right, just to prove to Simon that I actually can use technology, there we go. Psych regulations and code are coming in Victoria. Don't quite know when it's going to happen. It's going to be after 30 June. It's been going to happen for the last year, so there's no guarantees, but I'm pretty confident it will be by the end of the year. That would make the 7th jurisdiction in Australia who's adopted them. So is there a risk now around psychological hazards? And the answer is absolutely yes, because our legislation doesn't quite mirror, but reflects the other states and territories in major ways. And what is a breach of a psychological hazard goes to what is reasonably practicable in your primary duties. So the answer is the court is allowed to look at other jurisdictions and how they've identified hazards. And regulations work this way. They identify a particular primary duty and they say, in respect of that primary duty, this is what is required, and then the code explains what are the relevant controls that sit beneath it. So that's what's coming in. You're going to get a regulation that says, okay, these go to primary duties, these are psychological hazards. Simon will reflect more on those 14 hazards a bit later. And then the code describes not only what the hazards are, but how you're meant to control them. And under the law, that is evidence of what is reasonably practicable to do, okay? Now, I know that's a lot in the first 2 minutes, but I've only got 10 minutes, all right? So let's just step back a bit. A hazard is something that hurts someone. Does that make sense? A psychological hazard is some type of psychological behaviour, whether it's an act or omission, that harms a person in your workplace. That's pretty straightforward, isn't it? Okay? What the law says is we must do everything that is reasonably practicable to monitor people's health and provide a safe workplace. Reasonable practicability requires you to have a hazard. That's what's defined in the regulation and code. That's the 14 and a group of a lot more than 14 that Simon will chat about. It then says you must determine the risk. And what we know about psychological hazards are they make up well over 90% of the compensable claims that occur in psych injury. So these psychological hazards, not the bullying ones, which I'll talk about separately, but the more minor ones are the ones that have the highest aggregational damage done to people, okay? So we know the risk is high, and therefore we must institute controls. And the problem with psychological hazards is you can't use mechanical controls. You can't use engineering outcomes, can't you? We can't actually stick things over the top of people's heads and lock them to make them shut up. So we're dealing with things which are pretty binary in our methods of managing it because training and education is not enough. We are dealing with keeping people away from doing wrong things. What Simon will explain, and Matt later on, is that when you look at the psychological hazards grouping, there are two significant groupings. There are those which are serious wrongs, which are the bullying, harassment, workplace violence. In respect of those in Victoria, they are going to become notifiable incidents and must be notified within a 6-month cycle to WorkSafe. But it's not just notification, you've then got to come up with a plan of eradication for WorkSafe. So can you understand how difficult this is? And I want you just to reflect for a second. All women by the age of 40 have suffered some form of sexual harassment, okay? Everyone by the age of 40 has been subjected to some form of bullying. When you notify in respect of a complaint about bullying or sexual harassment, do you think you're going to eradicate it? Well, I think I can tell you what the answer is. No, you're going to do a lot to try and stop it. But you get on liability the moment you lodge the plan for eradication. Imagine at a governance level if your organisation doesn't follow through on that plan. That is a per se breach under the legislation. Does that make sense? So psychological hazards connect into reasonable practicability. Okay? The fourth element of reasonable practicability is the allocation of resources to ensure the control is effective. So what this legislation is requiring is a change not only in policy and procedures, like some of my lightweight mates have said in articles, it requires a whole governance shake-up because at a governance level you're going to have to satisfy yourself you have the evidence of what the current state of the psychological hazards are, you've identified the risks in respect of those psychological hazards, and you've introduced controls using the resource of the organisation. And for anyone who doesn't understand resources, that's budgetary. That's not just saying we'll just increase that to supervision because supervision on the hierarchy of control is relatively low in respect of a psychological hazard. So does that make sense? There are sort of 3 or 4 major hazards. The rest are all leadership issues. And I want to emphasise the allocation of work, how you allocate, how you reward and recognise, all those issues are leadership issues. And all of us have been subjected to leaders who have created stress for us. So all of us remember when we've been allocated a whole lot of work which is above our skill level. All of us remember when we had dumped a whole lot of work which was beneath our skill level on a very short timeline which was unreasonable. All of us have worked over weekends and we come in on Monday, the work is delivered and no one says thank you. Now that mightn't sound like much, but when you go through that, it does have an impact, and it's an aggregational impact. All of us have seen how I'm treated differently to another person in the business. The other person gets away with things. My boss keeps picking me up every time I make that mistake. So the justice issue is a really major issue that sits within those particular psychological hazards. Now, I'm not going to dwell on them for a long time, but what I want to say to you is when you go to work and you don't enjoy it, it's usually leadership, isn't it? Yeah? It's usually the things that really matter. Work is a place of release for most of us. Most of us go to work because it's a great, safe place to be. It actually, when things are difficult at home, and remember home creates around about 70% of the difficulties that manifest later at work, work is a place of healing for most of us. So when work goes off the beat, our safe place disappears, doesn't it? All right? And it goes little by little by little. And if we watch the actions of leaders and how they behave, what we see is a gradual uptake in poor behaviour towards a specific employee. You don't see it go like this, it goes like that. And at the same time as that behaviour changes towards that employee, the employee's resilience drops and capacity to manage it drops in a similar way. And that's where we see psychological harm done in a way which is irreversible. And remember, aggregational psychological harm is much harder to treat than single incident trauma, okay? Much harder to bring someone back. So this legislation is going to come through and the code is going to come through. You need to know it because it is evidence under the OHS Act of what is reasonably practical. So if you don't do what is in it, you'll be measured against it. Make sense? Like all the other codes of practice. And that is how a court will look at it. And coming to courts and regulators, I want to be clear the behaviour has changed. At a regulator level, we've seen in the last 3 weeks in Victoria a prosecution for sexual harassment and a prosecution for bullying through the OHS, okay? The regulators have said they're going to do it, and Daniel Andrews said 3 years ago when they brought in industrial manslaughter, which was brought in to deal with psychological hazards because it deals with a death outside of the workplace as well as inside the workplace, that the focus of the regulator will be dealing with psychological damage done to employees over the coming years. So the leader in Victoria has said it's going to happen. WorkSafe have started to change their focus. They're still looking at fall from heights and motorised equipment. But there is a genuine focus now on areas which they never touched before, which is sexual harassment and bullying, okay? So those major hazards, psychological hazards, will be a focus of prosecution. And I guess the other thing to remember is our courts have started lifting up their penalty to reflect the changes in penalties that exist under our new legislation. So the takeaways from today are really simple that I want you to do understand what these hazards are. If you're going to spend $1, spend it on supervisor skill because that's where the damage is being done. Read, understand the codes, change your governance structure so there is a reporting structure through to the highest level of the business based on evidence. Collect that evidence, and I don't have time to talk about what that evidence is, but it starts off very simply. Simple, short surveys, very good focus groups afterwards to give it richer detail, build supervisor skill to load into your HR system so your data gets richer and richer, and keep it going, okay? Other than that, keep up to date with safety law. It'll bite you, okay? Thanks.